Joining me now with his perspective on Pope Francis's comments about the incarceration of criminals, the Amazon Synod controversy, and much more is associate editor of The Spectator in the UK and host of the Holy Smoke podcast, Damian Thompson, who joins us from London. Damian, thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Well, Damian, as I mentioned in the intro, on September 14th, Pope Francis expressed opposition to life imprisonment for criminals. Now, this includes presumably serial killers, sex offenders. He's already condemned the death penalty and changed the catechism to reflect that preference. Here's what he said: life imprisonment is not the solution to problems, but a problem to be solved. Because if hope is locked up, there's no future for society. Never deprive anyone of the right to start over. Now, Damian, the justification for rejecting the death penalty was always this option for life imprisonment to protect society. That was John Paul's rationale and others. Now it appears Pope Francis is saying life imprisonment is out of the question. Your response?
My response is bafflement and dismay at what seems to be a very badly thought out argument, really just a little more than a sort of dinner party metaphor. Well, life imprisonment is a form of the death penalty. I think you'll find Catholics around the world, lots of them, including me, are opposed to the death penalty. Catholics opposed to life imprisonment, fewer of them, because I mean, is the Pope really saying that if Jeffrey Dahmer had, promised not to eat and cook any more of his fellow inmates, he would have been eventually let out of prison? It makes no sense at all to talk of anything but life imprisonment for the most serious offenders. And I actually don't think there's any public support for this. It's an unfortunate episode of the Supreme Pontiff just sort of thinking aloud. But actually, he has said before something along these lines and attributed it to the magisterium of the Church. The magisterium says that I always get worried when the Pope talks about the magisterium because, and I really don't mean this to sound rude, but I don't think it's his particular area of expertise, which is perhaps unfortunate given his job. But this, I think we can discount.
Yes, to expand on this a little more, the controversy over the Synod on the Amazon continues to grow as we get closer to October. The critics of the Synod worry that the program will be more political than pastoral, with emphasis on the environment, the possibility of married priests, and adapting Catholicism to indigenous cultures. Now, supporters of the Synod argue this is all a way of giving voice to the marginalized and giving them greater access to the sacraments. How is this controversy, and I'm interested in this, Damian, how is it playing out in Great Britain? And then I want to get into, the critique of the critics, if you will. But how is it playing in Great Britain? Is there any emphasis or any concern about this in Europe at large?
Yes, there is. I think what you'll find with English priests who are friends of mine, and they're not all conservatives, and Catholics generally, is that as soon as the subject of the Amazon Synod is mentioned, they roll their eyes. And they'd rather not talk about it because the instrumental laboris is so embarrassing and so theologically bizarre that I think people could almost rather not be reminded that this synod is happening and that this document is out there. It's a dreadful document, and I think what's happened over the last couple of months is that people have looked more closely at it. For example, Cardinal Muller has looked closely at it and noted all the repetitions, all the flattery of the Pope. And Cardinal Burke and Bishop Snyder have produced what's actually an excellent document, spelling out what they call the implicit pantheism of the Instrumentum Laboris. Well, it's only just about implicit. It's a wretched piece of work that bears very little relationship to Christianity, let alone Catholicism. And when I read it, I kind of think, well, if you want to believe that sort of thing about epiphanic places, such as the Amazon being a source of wisdom and reserve of wisdom for the planet, well, fine, go and sell wind chimes in West Hollywood, but don't call it Catholicism.
It made me, it put in mind this week, and I don't know if you saw this image, it was all over the internet, Union Theological Seminary in America. They posted a picture of a group of people confessing their sins to plants in the middle of what appeared to be a very sparsely populated church. But It did bring to mind some of the critiques of this synod. Now, Jesuit Father Thomas Reese wrote a column in America Magazine this week, taking what he calls theological conservatives to task for opposing the goals of the synod. He wrote this: they believe that 19th century European Catholicism is the absolute norm by which everything else must be judged. They know little about their own history and how Christianity was inculturated in Europe. Your thought?
Patronizing nonsense. For a start, what are the goals of the Synod? It's rather difficult to tell because it's essentially a work of science fiction in which the forest is anthropomorphized and the cosmos becomes a sort of sacred entity in itself. And there is this fiction of the native peoples of the Amazon almost representing the Garden of Eden. Now, how that's going to be turned into pastoral practice, I don't know, except that there's a hint that the Catholic Church somehow has to adapt its practices to those of pagan ancestors. I don't think that saying this is rubbish constitutes some sort of 19th century, reactionary opposition to progress. It's just saying, where do these sub-Teilhard witterings come from, and are we really expected to take them seriously as potential Catholic teaching?
The ongoing debate over this Amazon Synod, Damian, really has created a secondary controversy, the S word, schism. Pope Francis's ardent supporters say that conservatives, particularly in America, are fomenting schism by questioning the, as you mentioned, the direction of some of these synod initiatives. Is that what's really happening here? Traditional Catholics in the media in the U.S. and elsewhere are threatening schism?
Oh, this is what I call the Cardinal Burke staged the moon landings school of thought. It's the most complete rubbish. It's a deliberately manufactured fantasy. You've got this sort of Bond villain in a Kappa Magna and his sinister media network with a charismatic presenter. That last bit's true, Raymond. By the way. It's such garbage. And I think it's got several purposes. One, it expresses the anger of Team Francis, or whatever you want to call them, at the fact that Orthodox Catholicism is pretty vigorous and liberal Catholicism is moribund, though powerful and rich. And secondly, it is there to distract attention from, first of all, the chaos over the Amazon Synod, which I think really embarrasses people like Austin Ivory and Massimo, whatever he's called, who are well-educated and young enough to recognize this as antiquated 1960s nonsense. And so I actually think they're secretly embarrassed by the Amazon Synod. But they also want to detract attention. Everybody wants to detract attention from what looks like an actual schism situation, which is happening in Germany, where the German Church, which already has the unofficial authority to give communion to divorced people and Protestants, is now demanding some sort of binding national synod of bishops and lay associations, and that makes my flesh creep because I'm trying to think of what these lay associations might be like. So that's a real schismatic threat, and instead this fantasy schism is being created, and it's an insult. It's an insult.
And there are a series of books coming out that will attempt to propagate this black legend, and it's slanderous. I mean, it really, and as you said, it's a way to silence voices and distract from what's really going on, which are corruptions, innovations in Catholic thought and teaching and practice, and frankly, whether Damian Thompson and myself and a handful of other people are hit by a bus tomorrow or not, these questions will continue. This ongoing scandal is still present in various...
If we're hit by a bus, I can tell you who the driver will be.
We'll wait for the full investigation, Damian. We'll wait for the full investigation. I want to move on and talk about in the Catholic Church, it was reported this week, $4 billion have been spent over the last 20 years in sex abuse settlements. We also have a report, which I discussed with Ed Penton earlier, where you have the Vatican trying to make ends meet, the Pope asking Cardinal Marx, of all people, to please send out the command that all of the dicasteries in the Vatican find ways to close the budget gaps. What are we seeing here? What's going on, and what impact will this have not only on people here in the United States, but all around the world when they watch the financial part of this crisis play out?
Well, the Vatican finances have always been not just a terrible mess, but had a strong whiff of the mafiosi about them. And this is absolutely not something that started with this pontificate. It's one of the things that sadly destroyed the pontificate of Pope Benedict. Vatican finances are a horror story.
Right.
The Vatican actually hasn't got much money, and what money it does have, it throws away. And I think something like half of all the money it gets is from the United States.
Right.
And what does the Pope say? It's an honor when Americans attack me. So I just wanted to make that point about this Team Francis are playing to the sort of traditional Argentine anti-Americanism of the Pope. Because I think Team Francis feel they're being ignored by the Pope, which they are. And this is one way, this talk of the schism and all the rest of it is one way of getting him back on board. But the finances are unreformed. Now, Cardinal Pell would have reformed them. And, okay, I don't want to really endorse this conspiracy theory. I just want to say we should think about the fact that the man who was going to clean up the Vatican finances ended up in jail in Australia on a trumped-up charge.
Yeah, no, well, he was clearly trying to collect and focus the finances of the Vatican. He had done a full accounting and was trying to bring in Price Waterhouse to do a full forensic audit from the outside. That was stymied. So, I mean, there were certainly individuals who didn't want those reforms to go forward. And now all of those, as Ed Penton said earlier, many of the reforms that Pell insisted on were undone. So that is problematic, and they really, whether Pell is there or not, they need to institute those changes because they just made common sense.
Those changes will not be instituted under this pontificate. I give you that absolute guarantee. But actually, I'm not sure they'll be instituted under the next pontificate either.
Well.
Because the problem about the Vatican, if you spent any time there, is that it's chaotic. It's truly chaotic. It's backstabbing, it's amnesia, it's secretive, it's the very last place that is either going to want to be reformed or capable of drawing up any sort of financial reforms. But meanwhile, your viewers are paying for this chaos and paying for these settlements and paying for money to be wasted on horrible projects like the Amazon Synod, for example.
Well, Damian, I've said it for years. You and I have discussed it. What needs to happen is a full forensic audit of every parish, every diocese in the world, so that not only the officials in Rome, but the lay people can see exactly where their money is going. And I think that will reveal the various levels of corruption that are attached usually to money and mismanagement of it. Damian Thompson, thank you for being here.
They will reveal levels of corruption that we can hardly dream of. Thank you, Raymond.
We'll leave it there. Damian Thompson's commentary is at The Spectator's website, and you can follow him on Twitter at Holy Smoke. Love that handle.